Today's question to grapple with is, how far is too far? A common piece of advice given to children's ministry, youth ministry workers, whether that's the on-campus evangelistic type or the in-house, or even parents as well, to contemporize the language, to reinterpret it or reimagine the language of Scripture, memory verses, things of this nature, into something kids can understand. This has given birth to various different actual published paraphrases, like The Message, or The Word on the Street was one that had come out right when I first got into youth ministry. And it was the book of John, translated using kind of street level, vulgar language. Not in the inappropriate way when we typically use the word vulgar, but just common speech, slang, essentially. And The Message has been criticized. It's sometimes been referred to as the messy version by those who would detract against it, calling it something of a corruption of Scripture, that it is too far when it comes to being a paraphrase, that it doesn't treat Scripture as dignified or with as much dignity as it deserves. But you can go down to your local bookstore, your Christian bookstore, or even online through Lifeway, Crossway, Gospel Publishing House, some of these other organizations, and find actual instructives and curriculums that tell you or teach you or advise you on how to get your students or your disciples that are in your group or the children that come to your Sunday school class to reinterpret or reimagine their memory verses in the form of, let's say, emojis, or through text speech and text messaging shorthand, things of that nature, to help kind of bring it down to their level of understanding, or to contemporize it in a way that they can grasp it. And the question is that too far? Is that too much? Should we be allowing this? Should this be something that's encouraged among student ministries? Or is this going to be another one of those things that we look back on as being like the youth group gross out games or some other forms that you look back on it a little bit of mild shame of, I shouldn't have done that and I regret having done it? Is it? And I think a few things on this point. The first is that the Koine Greek that the original New Testament manuscripts were written in was not the high-level Greek. It was actually the low-level Greek. It was the common speech Greek. It's the kind of Greek that people would be speaking, that you would hear emanating out of bars and taverns, that you would hear in roadside conversations, or that people would use discussing things, just sitting under a shade tree on a hot summer day in a casual manner. It was that kind of a language. And that later, when they were making the English translation, such as the King James Bible, it was not the high-level language. In fact, the church used Latin, and one of the reasons why the people trying to translate the Scriptures into other languages, like Martin Luther translating it into German, or John Calvin into Swiss German for his Geneva Bible, or John Wycliffe and William Tyndale into English, was that Latin was the only official language of the church. That when they translated it into that Elizabethan, that it was actually the low-level English, the common or vulgar English that they were utilizing. Now, nowadays it's up here, and we would equate it alongside things like Shakespeare now, because the culture has changed. But it's us that's changing, not the language and not the text itself. That's why the New American Standard and then all these other translations have come to exist, is that to try and adapt to, quite frankly, our standards of spoken, written English are descending, not ascending. And so, in a way, the spirit of translating the scriptures into emojis being a very contemporary form of communication, or into text messaging shorthand, or into roadside slang, would be, in fact, in a similar, if not the same, spirit as what the original New Testament authors were actually doing. Aside from that, though, there is definitely room for the caution of keeping your hand on the railing while you're going down the stairs with this. That it is very easy to accidentally or even intentionally misrepresent the meaning of a passage as you are doing this. That because simply an image, an emoji, text messaging shorthand is very raw and imprecise. And so you can incidentally or intentionally convey the wrong message of a verse, a passage, a chapter by trying to reinterpret it this way. And you must guard against that with strictest terms. But I would not advise someone to go trying to publish an entire New Testament paraphrase in this way. But maybe it can be useful for certain students to hear John 3:16 in the form of text messaging shorthand, emojis. It could be helpful to them, and that could be the hook that gets them into reading something like the Message a little bit more, which in turn gets them to read the New Living Translation a little more, which in turn transitions them to the English Standard Version, and that in the way they start kind of climbing their way back up the staircase of intellectual scholarly translations. I would also encourage that everyone probably needs to have at hand various different translations based on what they're actually willing to read and engage with. If you've got a really nice student life application, New American Standard, lambskin leatherback Bible, but it's so intimidating to crack it open that it just sits on the shelf and collecting dust, then it's worth nothing to anyone. But if you're willing to pick up a paperback, The Message, book of Luke or of John, and flip through it and underline and dog-ear the pages, then you are benefiting far more from that imprecise paraphrase that people like to dump on than the person who is not reading their sacred family devotional Bible. That Charles Spurgeon used to say that so many people have Bibles that they refuse to open that it would be possible to write damnation in the dust on its cover. So, what's the takeaway here? Read the Bible however it is easiest to read it, in which a manner that you would read it. There's no use in having something so sacred it becomes useless. And also aspire constantly to increase your intellectual engagement with the text beyond what is comfortable to read. Studying should take a little bit more effort than just simple reading of the text. And so engage deeper as well. Do both of those things, and with your students, encourage them to do the same thing. If they're shallow, start shallow, but transition them to depth in a meaningful way that encourages them to read more, not less.